In the winter of 1537, England rejoiced at the birth of a prince who would become one of history's most chilling examples of power-corrupting youth. Edward Tudor, sixth of his name, entered the world amid celebrations that masked a terrible irony. The child hailed as England's salvation would grow into a monster whose cruelty surpassed even his infamous father's excesses. The infant prince's arrival cost his mother Jane Seymour her life, leaving him motherless and transforming him into an object of obsessive protection and veneration that would warp his developing psyche beyond repair. From his earliest moments, Edward existed in a bubble of artificial reverence that prevented any normal emotional development, unlike his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who had experienced Henry VIII's volatile temperament and learned caution through adversity. Edward knew only worship and submission from everyone around him. This constant adulation created a child who genuinely believed his desires carried divine authority, a delusion that would prove catastrophic once he gained real power. The education orchestrated for the young prince represented one of history's most successful experiments in creating a theological monster. Henry VIII, determined to produce the perfect Protestant heir, assembled a team of radical religious scholars whose primary qualification was not their pedagogical skill, but their unwavering commitment to extreme religious reform. These men approached Edward's education as a holy mission, systematically filling his impressionable mind with doctrines that portrayed compromise as sin and mercy as weakness. Chief among Edward's tutors was John Shackey, a brilliant Cambridge scholar whose intellectual gifts masked a fanatical temperament that viewed Catholics not as fellow Christians with different beliefs, but as literal agents of Satan requiring extermination. Under Shack's guidance, Edward's curriculum became a carefully orchestrated program of religious radicalization that would have impressed modern extremist movements with its systematic approach to ideological conditioning. By age 7, Edward was studying not children's stories, but detailed accounts of Catholic atrocities throughout European history. His reading material included graphic descriptions of supposed papal crimes, fabricated accounts of monastic corruption, and elaborate theological treatises explaining why Protestant monarchs had not just the right, but the divine obligation to eliminate Catholic influence through any means necessary. These lessons were reinforced through daily exercises, where the young prince practiced composing death sentences for imaginary Catholic criminals. The psychological impact of this education extended far beyond religious instruction. Edward learned to view human relationships purely through the lens of theological utility, categorizing every person he encountered as either an asset to Protestant England or an obstacle requiring removal. His tutors rewarded him for demonstrating emotional detachment from human suffering, while punishing any display of what they termed weak sentiment toward those designated as enemies of the faith. Most disturbingly, Edward's educators encouraged him to document his thoughts and reactions in detailed journals that provide chilling insights into his developing sociopathy. These writings, preserved in royal archives, reveal a child who by age 8 was already fantasizing about elaborate punishments for Catholics and showing genuine excitement at the prospect of implementing them. His tutors praised these disturbing compositions as evidence of his growing spiritual maturity and fitness for kingship. Edward's physical environment reinforced the psychological conditioning he received. Through formal education, the royal apartments became a carefully controlled space where every interaction reinforced his sense of divine supremacy. Servants were instructed to approach him with religious reverence, addressing him as Your Sacred Majesty and treating his most casual remarks as profound wisdom, requiring immediate implementation. The systematic isolation from normal human interaction created a boy who understood abstract theological concepts, but remained completely ignorant of basic human empathy. While he could recite complex arguments about predestination and divine grace, Edward had never experienced the ordinary childhood interactions that teach children about consequences, compromise, and the value of other people's feelings. His emotional development essentially froze at the level of a toddler's narcissistic worldview, except now equipped with sophisticated intellectual tools and absolute power. The few children admitted to Edward's presence were carefully selected, for their Protestant credentials and coached to treat him with the same reverential submission shown by adults. These orchestrated playmates reinforced rather than challenged Edward's developing superiority. Complex, creating artificial social interactions that further distorted his understanding of normal human relationships. When one young companion dared to disagree with Edward's interpretation of a biblical passage, the future king's reaction demanding the child be whipped for theological error revealed the extent to which his capacity for normal friendship had been destroyed even before ascending the throne. Edward displayed behavioral patterns that should have alarmed his caregivers, but instead filled them with pride at his mature spiritual development. At age 8, he began conducting mock trials of servants accused of various religious infractions, demonstrating a disturbing enthusiasm for the judicial process that focused entirely on punishment, while ignoring concepts of mercy or rehabilitation. These childhood games took on increasingly elaborate forms as Edward grew older. He created detailed ranking systems for different types of heresy, developed complex scoring methods for evaluating the severity of religious crimes, and invented new forms of correction that combined physical punishment with public humiliation. His tutors encouraged these activities as evidence of his natural aptitude for kingship, failing to recognize the obvious signs of developing psychopathy. Edward's relationship with his immediate family provided the clearest early warning of his emotional dysfunction. Despite sharing a household with his sisters during parts of his childhood, he showed no natural affection for Mary or Elizabeth, instead viewing them primarily as test cases for his developing theological theories. He kept detailed notes on their religious practices, recording any deviation from his increasingly rigid Protestant orthodoxy. Henry VIII's death in January 1547 placed unprecedented power in the hands of a child whose emotional and moral development had been systematically distorted by years of religious extremism and artificial reverence. The transition to actual kingship revealed the full extent of Edward's transformation, from innocent child to budding tyrant, as he immediately began implementing policies that shocked even his most radical supporters with their cruelty and inflexibility. The Regency Council, led by Edward's uncle the Duke of Somerset, initially attempted to moderate the young king's more extreme impulses, while maintaining the fiction that they were merely implementing his divine will. However, Edward quickly demonstrated that he had no intention of serving as a ceremonial figurehead for others' policies. Within weeks of his coronation, he was personally reviewing and modifying government decisions, invariably pushing them toward greater severity and religious extremism. Court records from Edward's early months as king reveal a child who treated matters of life and death with the same intellectual detachment he might apply to mathematical problems. When presented with lists of prisoners awaiting execution, Edward would methodically review each case, often increasing the recommended punishments, while providing detailed theological justifications for his decisions. Witnesses reported that he showed particular animation when discussing execution methods, demonstrating knowledge of various torture techniques that was both impressive and deeply disturbing in a 9-year-old. Edward's approach to governance revealed a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics that would have been remarkable in an adult ruler, but was terrifying in a child who had never learned normal human limitations. Rather than ruling through traditional medieval concepts of royal authority, Edward implemented what amounted to an early totalitarian system based on ideological purity and systematic surveillance of his subjects' private beliefs. The religious monitoring system that Edward established represented a masterpiece of paranoid control that anticipated modern surveillance states in its scope and invasiveness. Citizens were encouraged to report on their neighbors' religious practices through a complex network of informants that reached into every community, household, and even family unit. Children were specifically recruited to monitor their parents' private devotions, with special rewards offered for reports that led to successful prosecutions for heresy. Edward personally designed the bureaucratic apparatus that processed these denunciations, creating standardized forms for reporting suspected religious deviation and establishing quotas for successful prosecutions that turned religious persecution into a quantified administrative process. His journals from this period read like operational manuals for systematic oppression, filled with detailed discussions of which investigative techniques produced the most reliable confessions, and which punishments proved most effective at deterring future religious nonconformity. The psychological sophistication of Edward's persecution system reflected his unusual combination of childish cruelty and intellectual precocity. Rather than relying solely on physical torture, he developed elaborate methods of psychological manipulation designed to break his victims' will to resist. Prisoners were subjected to endless theological interrogations that lasted for days, forced to answer impossible contradictory questions about religious doctrine, while being deprived of sleep and basic comfort. Perhaps most chilling was Edward's apparent enjoyment of the persecution process itself. Unlike adult tyrants who might view oppression as a necessary but unpleasant aspect of maintaining power, Edward seemed to derive genuine intellectual satisfaction from the systematic destruction of his victims' resistance. He kept detailed notes on interrogation sessions, documenting how different techniques affected various personality types and refining his methods based on empirical observation of human suffering. The young king's chambers became a grotesque research facility where he maintained files on hundreds of religious prisoners, tracking their responses to different forms of pressure and developing increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological torture. His servants reported finding elaborate charts and diagrams mapping out the most effective sequences of physical and mental abuse for breaking different types of resistance, all annotated in Edward's careful handwriting with observations about their relative effectiveness. Edward's intellectual approach to cruelty extended to his treatment of the execution process itself. Rather than simply ordering deaths, he began experimenting with different methods of public execution, treating each event as an opportunity to gather data about public reactions and the psychological impact of various forms of visible punishment. He maintained detailed records of attendance at executions, crowd responses to different types of violence, and the effectiveness of various execution methods in deterring future religious nonconformity. Edward's relationship with his half-sisters provided perhaps the most disturbing example of how completely his capacity for normal human emotion had been destroyed by his upbringing and early exposure to absolute power. Rather than viewing Mary and Elizabeth as family members deserving of affection and protection, he approached them as theological problems requiring systematic solutions. Through careful application of religious and political pressure, his treatment of Mary revealed the full extent of his emotional dysfunction. Despite their shared childhood and the fact that she had shown him genuine affection during his early years, Edward viewed his Catholic half-sister purely as an obstacle to his religious vision that required removal through whatever means proved most effective. His private correspondence reveals a chilling evolution, from viewing Mary as a misguided family member to considering her as a dangerous enemy, whose continued existence threatened England's spiritual purity. The detailed plans Edward developed for eliminating Mary from the succession revealed a mind that had moved far beyond normal political calculation into genuine sociopathic territory. He drafted elaborate scenarios for her arrest, trial, and execution, complete with fabricated evidence and coerced witnesses who would testify to her alleged treason. These documents, preserved in royal archives, demonstrate the same methodical approach to family destruction that characterized his broader persecution campaigns. Edward's relationship with Elizabeth proved more complex, but equally disturbing. While he approved of her Protestant beliefs, he viewed his younger sister primarily as a useful tool for cementing Protestant alliances through strategic marriage, rather than as a person deserving of consideration for her own happiness or well-being. His plans for Elizabeth's future involved treating her as a diplomatic commodity, whose personal preferences were irrelevant compared to the political advantages her marriage might provide to Protestant England. At the onset of serious illness in Edward's final years created a paradoxical situation where physical weakness seemed to intensify, rather than moderate his psychological extremism, as his body began failing due to what modern medical analysis suggests was a combination of tuberculosis and possible heavy metal poisoning. His religious fanaticism burned with increasing intensity, as if he were trying to compress a lifetime of Protestant purification into his remaining months. Court physicians documented a disturbing pattern where Edward's episodes of physical suffering were accompanied by periods of fevered religious preaching, during which he would deliver rambling sermons about the necessity of eliminating Catholic influence, even if it required killing every Catholic in England. These rants initially appeared to be symptoms of his illness, but his lucid intervals revealed that these extreme statements reflected genuine intentions, rather than disease-induced delirium. The young king's awareness of his own mortality seemed to trigger an increasingly desperate urgency about implementing his religious vision before death could intervene, rather than inspiring reflection or spiritual growth. His declining health pushed Edward toward contemplating solutions to the Catholic problem that would have shocked even his radical advisors with their scope and brutality. His final months were spent drafting increasingly elaborate plans for religious genocide that revealed a mind completely divorced from normal human moral constraints. Edward's final political act, the attempt to bypass both his sisters in favor of Lady Jane Grey, represented the culmination of his transformation from innocent child to would-be architect of religious totalitarianism. Working with ambitious nobles who shared his Protestant extremism, Edward crafted a succession plan that would have resulted in the deaths of both Mary and Elizabeth, and the installation of a puppet regime controlled by religious fanatics. The conspiracy that emerged from these planning sessions revealed the full extent of Edward's political sophistication and moral bankruptcy. Rather than simply changing the succession, the plot involved comprehensive plans for eliminating Catholic influence through mass executions, property seizures, and the establishment of a permanent religious police force that would monitor every aspect of English life. Edward's personal involvement in developing these plans was both detailed and enthusiastic, suggesting that he viewed the conspiracy as the culmination of his life's work, rather than a desperate expedient. Documents preserved from this period show Edward drafting lists of Catholics to be executed, properties to be confiscated, and laws to be enacted in his Protestant utopia. His handwriting, increasingly shaky due to his illness, filled page after page with plans for what amounted to systematic religious persecution on a scale that would have made the Spanish Inquisition appear moderate by comparison. The boy who had once seemed like an innocent victim of adult political manipulation revealed himself as the driving force behind a conspiracy that would have fundamentally transformed English society. The manner of Edward's death provided a grotesquely appropriate conclusion to a life that had been consumed by hatred and cruelty. Modern medical analysis suggests that the young king suffered from a combination of pulmonary tuberculosis and what was likely chronic arsenic poisoning, possibly administered inadvertently by his own physicians in misguided attempts to treat his condition with heavy metal-based medicines. The irony of Edward's situation was not lost on contemporary observers. The king who had poisoned England with religious hatred was himself being slowly destroyed by literal poison administered by the very people trying to save his life. As toxic substances accumulated in his system, Edward experienced increasingly severe symptoms that transformed his final months into a prolonged agony that seemed to mirror the suffering he had inflicted on his victims. Court records document the horrifying progression of Edward's final illness with clinical detail that reveals both the medical ignorance of the period and the gruesome nature of his decline. His body began emitting foul odors weeks before his death. His skin took on an unnatural greenish tint that suggested severe toxicity, and his hair and fingernails began falling out in patterns consistent with heavy metal poisoning. The boy who had once been considered one of the most beautiful of Henry VIII's children became a grotesque shadow of his former self. Perhaps most disturbing, Edward remained lucid enough throughout his decline to understand what was happening to him while being powerless to stop it. His final weeks were spent alternating between screams of physical agony and fevered rants about Protestant martyrdom, creating a deathbed scene that combined physical horror with psychological breakdown in ways that traumatized even his most hardened attendants. Edward's last coherent acts revealed the complete absence of any capacity for reflection, forgiveness, or spiritual growth that might have been expected from someone facing imminent death, rather than seeking reconciliation with his family or expressing regret for his persecution of religious minorities. The dying king spent his final energies cursing his Catholic sister Mary and begging his conspirators to proceed with their genocidal plans even without his personal supervision. His final recorded words were not expressions of love, forgiveness, or spiritual peace, but rather continued expressions of hatred for religious opponents and desperate pleas for his Protestant vision to survive his death. Witnesses reported that he died not in spiritual tranquility, but in a state of frustrated rage at his inability to complete his planned destruction of Catholic England, creating a deathbed scene that was both pathetic and terrifying in its revelation of complete moral bankruptcy. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death on July 6, 1553, revealed how completely his carefully orchestrated plans had depended on his personal authority and driving will. Without the young king's fanatical energy behind the conspiracy, it collapsed within days as moderate Protestants abandoned what they suddenly recognized as an extremist plot that would have destroyed England rather than saving it. Lady Jane Grey, the intended beneficiary of Edward's coup, found herself virtually friendless as nobles who had seemed committed to the Protestant cause discovered urgent business elsewhere once they realized the full implications of Edward's plans. The swift collapse of the conspiracy revealed how completely Edward had miscalculated both the loyalty of his supporters and the appetite of English Protestants for the kind of systematic religious persecution he had envisioned. The reign of Edward VI stands as one of history's most disturbing examples of how absolute power can corrupt even childhood innocence when combined with systematic indoctrination and complete isolation from normal human relationships. Modern psychological analysis of Edward's documented behavior reveals clear patterns consistent with psychopathic personality development, suggesting that England was ruled for 6 years by what can only be described as a child sociopath with unlimited authority. The transformation Edward underwent from cherished infant to religious fanatic offers sobering insights into the malleability of human moral development and the dangers posed by educational systems that prioritize ideological purity over ethical formation. His case demonstrates how intellectual sophistication, when divorced from emotional development and moral instruction, can create individuals capable of rationalizing any level of cruelty in service of abstract principles. Perhaps most chilling is the question of what might have occurred if Edward had survived to reach full adulthood. With his extremist worldview intact, his plans for Protestant England included establishing a permanent surveillance state, eliminating all Catholic influence through systematic persecution, and creating a totalitarian system that would have monitored every aspect of his subjects' private lives. The teenager who died in 1553 had already begun implementing these policies on a smaller scale, suggesting that a mature Edward VI might have created one of history's most oppressive regimes. Edward's story resonates with uncomfortable relevance in an era marked by ideological extremism and the weaponization of religious belief for political purposes. His systematic approach to persecution, his use of surveillance networks to monitor private belief, and his ability to rationalize cruelty through elaborate theological arguments provide troubling parallels to modern authoritarian movements that combine religious rhetoric with systematic oppression. The ease with which Edward's educators transformed an innocent child into a religious fanatic serves as a warning about the vulnerability of young minds to systematic indoctrination. His case demonstrates how educational systems can become instruments of radicalization when they prioritize ideological conformity over critical thinking and moral development, creating individuals who view disagreement as heresy and compromise as betrayal. Most soberly, Edward's reign illustrates how good intentions in this case, the desire to create a godly Protestant kingdom, can be corrupted into instruments of oppression when pursued without regard for human cost or moral limitation. His story stands as a permanent reminder that the combination of absolute authority with ideological certainty, regardless of the supposed nobility of the underlying cause, creates conditions where even children can become monsters. The death of Edward VI may represent one of the few instances in history where a monarch's early demise prevented rather than caused national catastrophe. His passing at age 15 spared England from the full implementation of his increasingly extreme vision and allowed for a return to more moderate policies under his successors, even including the Catholic restoration under Mary Tudor that Edward had desperately sought to prevent. The relief that followed Edward's death, though rarely expressed openly by his contemporary subjects, reflected a collective recognition that England had narrowly escaped a form of tyranny that would have surpassed even the worst excesses of the medieval period. His reign serves as a historical cautionary tale about the dangers of placing unlimited power in the hands of anyone, regardless of age, who has been systematically conditioned to view disagreement as evil and mercy as weakness. In the end, Edward VI's brief but terrible reign stands as testament to humanity's capacity for moral corruption under the right conditions, while simultaneously demonstrating the resilience of societies that ultimately reject extremism in favor of more moderate governance. His death marked not just the end of a life, but the end of what might have been England's darkest possible future, a reminder that sometimes mortality itself can serve as humanity's salvation from its own worst impulses.